Hello, everybody. It's Mr. Hendricks coming to you once again from Yukon, Oklahoma. Today is April 28th, 2020. On this day in history, 1945, Benito Mussolini, Il Duce, dictator of Italy, and his mistress were caught trying to flee into Switzerland and were executed. And that is all the relevant history that I have for you for today from April 28th. Again, I'm coming to you from my garage because, well, this is the quietest place in the house where I can maintain my sanity. It's also probably the cleanest part of my house right now, truth be told. It's also where I get to hang out with my beloved, it's my Trans Am, okay? Anyway, I know that's goofy. As always, I like to start class off with good things. So if you'd like to comment on the thread in Google Classroom where I'm sharing this and share good things with me, that would be great. Yes, Miranda, I know being today Tuesday, it is one day closer to Friday. So, but go ahead and feel free to comment that anyway, right? Although at this time, who even knows what day of the week it is most of the time, right? I want to pick up where we left off with the last lecture. I'll share my screen with you here. Go to my PowerPoint. And there we go. So if you remember where we were at last time, we were talking about the U-2 incident, the downing of the U-2 with Gary Powers. Khrushchev, the leader of Russia, or the Soviet Union at that time, very disappointed in Eisenhower's actions, and basically tells Eisenhower, like, I'm not going to deal with you. I know it's an election year for you guys. I will just deal with whoever the next guy is, okay? The next guy ends up being John F. Kennedy, but not before an election in which Kennedy really separates himself from his contender, his opponent, Richard Nixon, with the first ever televised debate. It's in this televised debate that Kennedy really looks a lot better than Nixon on television, which does not do well for Nixon. Great for Kennedy. Kennedy looked good. He looked tan. He looked healthy. Nixon, first of all, not a very attractive guy. Even after he shaved, I mean, the guy had 5 o'clock shadow at 9 o'clock in the morning. He looked pasty under the lights. He was just getting over a flu or something, like he wasn't feeling well. He was sweaty. He kept shifting his weight because he had a leg that was injured or something. He pulled a muscle or something like that. I don't remember what the exact circumstance was. But the bottom line is Kennedy looked a lot better on television. People who listened to the debate on the radio felt like Nixon did the better job in the debate. Those who watched it on TV thought that Kennedy did a better job. Lo and behold, 1960, Kennedy wins the election. Nevertheless, okay, the zombie apocalypse, as I compared it to, the Cold War, the ideological war with the Soviet Union and communism continues, okay? And so all of the policies of containment and everything else that have gone from Truman through Eisenhower's administration are going to continue with Kennedy. One issue that Kennedy has to deal with is in 1959, Fidel Castro took over Cuba, and he was receiving military aid from the Soviet Union. So now you have a communist regime has set up shop in a country that is a mere 90 miles from the Florida Keys. So this is no longer a thing that's happening over on the other side of the world. This is no longer an Eastern European issue or a Russia issue or an Asian issue. It is now a Western Hemisphere issue, something that's taking place within our own backyard. And so Kennedy's got a few challenges he's going to have to face, and he knows this going in. So under Kennedy, a few things that he outlined in his inaugural address, and I would recommend that you watch it. It's a pretty decent one. Under Kennedy, the military is focused on sort of a smaller scale response. So in 1961, the United States created the Special Forces, so Green Berets, Navy SEALs, Delta Force, some of those things. Those sort of surgical responses, small units that can go in, take care of something, get in, get out, and hopefully not even be detected. We see some of that happening. Kennedy really wanted to focus on the third world, okay, that 2/3 of the world that's a lot more impoverished than the rest of it. And so the Peace Corps was created, and this was created out of something that he outlined in his inaugural address. The Peace Corps goes out on missions of freedom. So volunteers would join the Peace Corps. They provided technical, educational, health service, farming instruction, all kinds of different things for developing countries. And the reason why they were focused on developing countries is because, remember, communism grows in stagnant economies. And if you can go into a developing country, an impoverished country, and provide things to allow them to stand on their own. So in a lot of ways, this is like the Marshall Plan, okay? We go in and we help the economies of these places. And when you're able to help them, communism looks a whole lot less attractive, okay? So in this case, it's kind of that idea of like, you give a man a fish, you feed him for a day, you teach a man a fish you feed him for a lifetime, so that when the communists come up and say, hey, we've got fish, they go, hey, we're good. We don't want what you're selling, because what you're selling is crap. Okay, we can do our own fishing, all right? And so, but he's got this issue. He's got Cuba right there. And so there's this old plan that had come out of the Eisenhower and Dulles era, that involved landing in Cuba with a force of Cuban nationals, people who were frustrated with what Castro had done. I mean, Castro was ruining the country, and so there was supposed to be sort of like a kind of a surgical precision type of incursion that was supposed to take place at the Bay of Pigs. The Bay of Pigs on April 17th, 1961. Kennedy sees an opportunity to eliminate an unfriendly government close to the United States, Castro. 1,400 CIA-led, so the CIA was involved, right? CIA-led anti-Castro Cuban exiles were ready to invade and fight, and somebody got tipped off. They knew they were coming. The mission was a total failure, all right? All but about 300 of these folks were killed. Fueled a lot of anti-American sentiment in Cuba. Castro used it to his advantage for sure. Kennedy's got just a ton of egg on his face from this one because it is a total failure. Khrushchev, who's helping to, remember the Soviet Union is helping to prop up Castro's regime. Khrushchev says, all right, well, obviously you're somebody I can't trust either. And so just as a demonstration of how much I dislike what you've done here, Mr. Kennedy, I'm going to build a wall. And where did Khrushchev build a wall? Not in Cuba, all right, but in Berlin. Okay, that border between East and West Berlin, there had never been a wall there. There were checkpoints, other things like that. Now the Soviets step in and they build a wall. They separate East and West Berlin, okay? No clearer picture is there a division between East and West. The ideologies of the Soviet Union and against the Western world than the Berlin Wall. The Berlin Wall is a symbol of this division. And families who had been able to see each other, who were living on either side of the city, are now separated, and they won't see each other until 1991, okay? It's a really, really bad deal. And Kennedy, so one of the Kennedy's earliest foreign affairs issues turns into a complete disaster, okay? So there's another shot of the Berlin Wall, provided a nice canvas for graffiti. It's kind of interesting, once the wall came down, a lot of that got shipped around the world, and you find it in different museums and places like that. Remember the U-2, okay, America's spy plane? Well, America's spy plane is flying some missions over Cuba when the U-2 discovers that there are some missile emplacements in Cuba. They captured images of a Soviet missile site, okay? These aren't the big ICBMs. These are more like the medium range ballistic missiles, okay? MRBMs, close enough to be able to strike a lot of major targets in the United States, and that's not good. Okay, so now we have missile sites that are pointed right at the United States from a mere 90 miles off the Florida Keys. Not a whole lot different from what the United States had. The United States had missile sites in Turkey and other places that were pointed straight at the Soviet Union. So he was just kind of doing what we were doing at the time. But Kennedy demands that Khrushchev remove the missiles. On October 22nd, he addressed the nation and he announced a naval quarantine. Hey, there's that word again, quarantine. You've seen that before, or a blockade of Cuba. JFK he doesn't pull any punches on this one. He's very direct, says he blames the USSR for a reckless and provocative threat to world peace. By October 24th, again, dealing through diplomatic channels. So there's no direct phone calls going on here. Americans are driving to the Soviet embassy, talking with their ambassadors. They're bringing people to the White House. They're working through diplomatic channels. There's no direct conversations that are taking place between Kennedy and Khrushchev. It's all done through people and intermediaries. So October 24th, Khrushchev refused to remove the missiles. On October 26th, JFK's executive committee, okay, the ExComm, this is his closest advisors. It included the Secretary of State and Joint Chiefs of Staff and Kennedy's brother Robert, who was the Attorney General. They discussed the possibility of invading Cuba. And on October 27th, Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles. There's a lot I'm leaving out here because I'm trying to do this in the interest of time. There's a lot of back and forth going on. Let me give you the bottom line of what happened here. This was a scary, scary moment. There's about 13 days here that are extremely frightening because this is about the closest the United States and the Soviet Union actually ever came to going to nuclear war with one another. You may have heard the term DEFCON, okay, defense condition. DEFCON, it's sort of an alert system. We have something similar that we use today. It's kind of like color coded, but DEFCON 5 is like everything's fine. We're all good. Every single country in the world is happy with each other. We could all join hands right now around the campfire, sing Kumbaya, and all is good. DEFCON 1 is the lowest. DEFCON 1 is missiles are in the air, bend over and kiss your butt goodbye. Okay, that's DEFCON 1. We were at DEFCON 2, which was frightening. It was scary. A lot of Americans were scared. I mean, people for nearly 2 weeks practically just held their breaths for 2 weeks. It was just like nobody moved. I mean, this stuff's getting real. The crap's going to hit the fan. People were stockpiling things in their storm shelters and using them as fallout shelters. It was a scary, scary time. But eventually, by October 27th, thanks to the naval quarantine and this big face-off that was taking place, Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles. Kennedy said that he wouldn't invade Cuba. The United States secretly removed our nuclear weapons from Turkey. And on October 28th, Khrushchev basically had to publicly announce an agreement with Kennedy. So really on this case, where Kennedy has the embarrassment coming from Bay of Pigs, with the Cuban Missile Crisis, it's really kind of Khrushchev who sort of has the embarrassment at this point. In fact, here's some of the effects of this. I mentioned this is the closest the United States has ever come to nuclear war. One thing that they decided was necessary was a hotline that was installed between the White House and the Kremlin. That's a really big deal. To be able to directly talk to another world leader over the phone is a big deal. But the hotline means that you just pick up the phone and it automatically dials the other end, okay? And in fact, it was a special phone. It was kind of like a emergency use type of thing. Only it had a different color. So it was like you had your normal phone was like black, and then this one was like red. Okay, kind of like the Bat phone on the original the Batman TV show with Adam West. But that's how he talked to Commissioner Gordon. Anyway, right. I won't geek out on that one. Okay. And then it also resulted in a 1963 nuclear test ban treaty. Khrushchev really does end up losing a lot of credibility in the USSR. It won't be very much longer before he's actually forced out of office into retirement, goes to live out the rest of his days in a dacha out in the countryside, and nobody ever really hears from Nikita Khrushchev ever again after this. When all was said and done, Secretary of State Dean Rusk said, "Remember when you report this, that eyeball to eyeball, they blinked first." Okay. And so Kennedy really kind of gains a lot of credibility from this. Yeah, people are critical of it, but tough time being in that office. There's some links to some stuff here on YouTube that I normally show in class. We'll skip that for right now. And then we get to November 22nd of 1963. A day that started out with a lot of promise. Kennedy and the First Lady go and so it's John F. Kennedy and Jacqueline Kennedy right there go to Dallas to go to a Democratic Party rally. I think you all are aware of what happens next. Again, great day, lots of smiles, beautiful day, Bluebird Day, great day to be out, great day to ride in a convertible, maybe. And then this happens, okay? This is a shot from the Zapruder film, probably one of the most scrutinized pieces of video in the history of the world. I think one of those links that I just shared was a link to the Zapruder film if you want to go back and watch it. It is graphic, I will tell you that. But we know what happened to Kennedy. We know that the murder, the assassination was pinned on Lee Harvey Oswald. That this was the rifle that he bought from a catalog. Not a very expensive rifle at all. Not really much of a long-range rifle. In fact, for that shot to take place from that book depository window overlooking Dealey Plaza, would have had to have been an expert marksman, and even at that would have been a tough choice. The Carcano rifle really not the choice for carrying out that type of long-distance assassination, which is what has led a lot of people to believe that Oswald did not work alone, and tons of theories about different conspiracies. Was it the CIA? Was it the Soviets? Was it aliens from outer space? And how far the conspiracy theories go it depends on how large of an aluminum foil helmet you like to put on your head. To add to the mystery of it all is when Jack Ruby comes up and shoots Oswald while he was being transported. So that just sort of fuels all the further conspiracies about that. Caught the exact moment that he got shot, which there's a lot of memes about that one. That's kind of interesting. So Kennedy has been assassinated. He's now out of the picture, and Lyndon B. Johnson takes the oath of office on Air Force One between Dallas Love Field and Andrews Air Force Base. I always find this to be a very interesting picture. There's Johnson taking the oath, and there is Jacqueline Kennedy, who is experiencing arguably the worst day of her life. That's odd that she even had to stand there for that. I know there's more to the story, and normally in class I would spend a lot more time on this. I'm trying to save you some time, just kind of do an overview here, but that was for regular U.S. history. Okay, one of Johnson's initiatives is the Great Society. He demanded an end to poverty and racial injustice. Begins working heavily with Congress for the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Said that no memorial oration or eulogy could more eloquently honor President Kennedy's memory than the earliest possible passage of the bill for which he fought for so long. And that he said that in his address to Congress in November of 1963. So Johnson takes on this war on poverty, tax cuts for the middle class, the Economic Opportunity Act, Job Corps, VISTA, Head Start. Some of these are programs that are still around today. not to mention Medicare and Medicaid. You probably hear some things about that. There was the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which just took the National Defense Education Act and just took a little bit further. The Water Quality Act of 1965, the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, Clean Water Restoration Act of 1966. Johnson had a lot of initiatives there during that first term of his presidency. And then we have the thing that really sort of really ends up defining Johnson's presidency, and it's not in a good way, okay? And that takes us to a country that in the 1960s, most Americans couldn't find on a map, and that is the country of Vietnam. Again, it was a French colony since the 1800s. The French were no longer able to hold on to that area. Big surprise, the French failed at something. And the Soviets supported the communist leader Ho Chi Minh. The United States had been spending money since the early 1950s to help France maintain control of the region, to the tune of about $2.6 billion. So we talked about with the Truman administration, talked about the Marshall Plan, $13 billion. Why are we trying to help France maintain control? Well, dominoes, okay, and not the pizza either. Eisenhower had actually said this in 1954. He says, you've got a row of dominoes set up, knock over the first one, what happens to the last one? It will certainly go over very quickly, okay? So Asia, after all, has already lost 450 million of its peoples to communist dictatorship. Talk about China, talk about North Korea. And we simply can't afford greater losses. And so it's that idea of dominoes. You know, you knock over one and you know, right? So here's a depiction of that, okay? If Laos and Vietnam fall to, oops, did not mean to click that, right? I always like to use my little, oh, there it is. Why do I keep clicking on the wrong thing? You guys are like, wow, he's really lost it. Yes, I have. I want there. I like my green laser, all right? Okay. Oops. Okay, laser pointer, not working today. Okay, whatever. I don't understand it. Sorry about that, guys. Okay, so get Laos and Vietnam. If they fall to the communists, what's next? Taiwan, the rest of the Korean Peninsula, the Philippines, Japan, Canada, United States. Okay, remember we're still battling against communism. Who's pushing the dominoes here? That's right, the Soviet Union. Okay. So domino theory. So if Vietnam were to fall to Ho Chi Minh, then the rest of Southeast Asia would fall as well, putting Japan, Philippines, Australia, other areas in jeopardy, okay? So get to August of 1964, the North Vietnamese torpedo boats attacked the USS Maddox, which was patrolling the Gulf of Tonkin. Normally, you know what, I should have put a map in here. Normally I'm pointing to a physical map in our classroom. My bad, I should have put one in here. You can pull up a map of Vietnam, you can look at it yourself. Johnson asked Congress to authorize use of force to defend our US forces. Congress agreed unanimously to the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which was essentially a blank check, okay? Authorize the president to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against forces of the United States to prevent further aggression. Johnson takes this and runs with it, okay? That all necessary measures line right there, he's like, oh yeah, I got this. And so what ends up happening is, oh, I'm getting a little ahead of myself there, he ends up committing a ton of troops to Vietnam, and then when that proves not to be enough, even more troops, and then even more troops, and then eventually you have the issuance of the draft and the lottery system for the draft, and people's numbers getting called and going, and it really kind of turns into a big thing here. So by 1965, the military is fully involved in Vietnam. Again, a place that up to this point, most people couldn't even find it on a map if they had to. Operation Rolling Thunder was a sustained bombing of North Vietnam between 1965 and 1968. About 6 million tons of bombs. That's more than all the bombs that were dropped on Germany from all forces during World War II. Also was the use of chemical agents like Agent Orange, which was really meant to defoliate the jungle, because the jungle was so thick, the canopy was so thick they couldn't see in there. And so they were trying to defoliate it, but also it proves really well if it kills plants, a lot of times it kills people too, so they did that. Then napalm, which was also really intended to be to also defoliate, kill vegetation. Basically, napalm is a barrel of jellied gasoline with a detonator that's dropped, and so when it drops and hits, I mean, it's like the fires of hell, and so they would just use those for airstrikes and just napalm the crap out of the enemy, and it was a really, really awful thing. I won't take the time to read that quote, but this was Johnson's justification for staying in Vietnam. He says, "We will stay in Asia and around the world whose independence rests in large measure on the confidence of America's word, American protection." So it felt like that, that we belong there. He just kept doing everything he could to try to justify it. By 1968, we had 500,000 soldiers that were serving in country. 30,000 had suffered casualties in combat. Vietnam is known as the first living room war. There were tons of media personnel that were embedded with different forces that were in country that were reporting from Vietnam. And at first, they were reporting all of the casualties. After a while, the U.S. government felt like that wasn't really good for the war effort anymore, and they actually started censoring a lot of that was happening. But it was on the news every single night. It dominated the news cycle for the remainder of the 1960s. It was on there every single night, and it really kind of wears on the American people. So they actually found that support for the war actually fell off with the increased amount of television coverage. Colleges and universities were really the ones that kind of led the way in protesting against the conflict in Vietnam. So we see the birth of the counterculture movement, the hippie movement. Those children of those baby boomers, those children of the generation that had fought in World War II, now are sort of in a state of rebellion, starting in places like UC Berkeley. They're doing all kinds of wild and crazy things. Apparently, usually I have a picture here of hippies. Not sure where that went. My computer's being really funny today. Used to make a joke about that. By the way, that's Snoopy's best friend, Woodstock. Okay, music festival at Woodstock is what I was going to talk about. Usually I should have a picture from Woodstock. Where the heck that went either. Okay, well, moving on. Vietnam does demonstrate a few changes that I already mentioned about warfare. In one case, the cavalry changes from being on horses to being in Hueys instead. These helicopters become the new U.S. cavalry. And then we have something that happens in 1968. The Tet Offensive took place that really shifted public opinion against the war. Led to the eventual withdrawal from Vietnam. It was a coordinated attack that took place on the Vietnamese holiday known as Tet or Thet. There was a horribly coordinated attack, and even though it was the United States was able to repel it, it was extremely costly to American forces. It was even more costly to public opinion. In fact, really Johnson after the Tet Offensive in 1968 and the criticism for his policies, he really just he drops out of the race. In 1968, he's like, I'm not going to run again. I can't win. He knew what was going on. He knew that he had been made a pariah because of all this. And so that really opens the door quite easily in 1968 for Richard Nixon to assume the presidency in 68. A lot of American people had a growing distrust of the government during the Vietnam War, something we often identify as the credibility gap. Nixon was really kind of looking for a different way to get us out of Vietnam, so he called for something called peace with honor, wanted to do a major troop withdrawal, so troops began really withdrawing in large numbers in January of 1973. Also in 1973, Congress passed the War Powers Act, which said that the president must consult Congress within 48 hours of committing U.S. troops to a foreign conflict. So really kind of taking things back to the way that they were really supposed to be, as spelled out in the Constitution. The last of the troops withdrew from Saigon as the Viet Cong took over in April of 1975. This is probably one of the most famous pictures to come out of that era. This is the last helicopter that was trying to get refugees out of Vietnam in 75. In fact, there were so many people that they evacuated that they put them all on the decks of these aircraft carriers that they didn't have room for the helicopters, and so they actually pushed the helicopters off into the water, and they sunk to the bottom of the Gulf of Tonkin. So, I mean, fuel and oil and all, yeah, not a great thing. Some of the things that we see come out of this era, the 25th Amendment, which clarifies what happens upon the death, removal, or resignation of the president or vice president. Ironically, this will come into play during Nixon's administration. The 26th Amendment gave adults between the age of 18 and 21 the right to vote. This was based on the mantra, old enough to fight, old enough to vote. So the voting age goes from 21 to 18. Nixon really pushed for a détente, all right, it's a little French word there, the easing of hostility or strained relations, especially between countries. Nixon had pursued a détente with both the Chinese and the Soviets. Nixon was working on establishing an economic relationship with China. Okay, we know that that's been on our news a lot over the last few years, our economic relationship with China. One thing that happens in 1971 is the release of the Pentagon Papers. It was a report by the Department of Defense. Said the United States had been misled about the public about Vietnam. The public did not like that. In fact, the public really feels like they have been duped. And one of the things that we see happen, usually I have my regular U.S. history students look at this, why I showed that. People mistrust the government more than they ever had at any point in history. And then you have something else that takes place that really kind of drives an even further wedge between the American people and their trust of their government. And it's something that takes place at this building right here. Now, I took this picture a few years ago when I was in Washington, D.C. I'd just gotten done eating dinner down on this little wharf down on the Potomac. I was looking over there, and the building that's actually over here to the right, that's the Kennedy Center. I was looking at that, and this building caught my eye, and I was like, wait a minute, I know that building. That's the Watergate complex. And so I took that shot, and then my buddy Scott and I walked over, and I took a picture of the building from this side, from street view, where the other one was the river view. And this is where this whole thing went down, okay? This is where there was a break-in that took place. The Democratic National Committee's headquarters was in this building. There were some people who broke in an attempt to plant bugging devices and try to find anything that would gain Nixon an edge in the election in 1972. Two young, hungry reporters by the name of Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein broke the story for the Washington Post, getting information from a secret informant who would only refer to himself by a code name. The code name was Deep Throat. And the story just continued to grow from there, discovering that Nixon, eventually it comes out that Nixon was secretly taping every single conversation that was happening in the Oval Office. He would not release the tapes, and that became a huge point of contention. So the American people, and I'm skipping a lot of things here, so I'm really trying to get through all of this with you guys without taking up too much of your time. So again, this would be something we would do in class over a few days, okay? So again, my apologies on that. Americans really had already felt betrayed by the Pentagon Papers. The Americans were already not trusting their government. Woodward and Bernstein just continued to uncover information. The more information they uncovered, the more people were willing to come in and tell their story. And so the American public really wanted Nixon to pay for his dishonesty. Americans really wanted to know what was really going on at Watergate. Was Nixon the really one in charge? Were these plumbers, these people who went out and fixed these leaks, were they doing so under his orders, or was it indirect? what did Nixon really know? And the American people wanted to know. And so all these scandals and the scandal was taking place. The vice president at the time, Spiro Agnew, had already resigned because he had his own controversy, his own scandal that was going on. You've got the Watergate scandal that's happening. Nixon says, "Oh, I don't need to turn over my tapes because I have executive privilege." And finally, the Supreme Court steps in and says, "Hey, you don't have executive privilege when it comes to a criminal investigation. Sorry, you can't do that." And so one thing that gets affirmed through the Watergate scandal is that the laws are superior even to the office of the president. No president is above the law. No individual in the United States is above the law. The law applies to everybody, even the person who's in the highest office. So Nixon's resignation meant that Gerald Ford became 30th president of the United States, because Gerald Ford was, because of the 25th Amendment, there was no vice president. Nixon had appointed the job to Gerald Ford. Everybody liked Jerry Ford. Jerry's a Michigan guy, football star from Michigan. He was very well liked. And so when Nixon resigned in 1974, Gerald Ford became the 30th president of the United States. One of the things that Ford is really well known for is pardoning Nixon. So he goes back later. So a lot of people thought, a lot of people thought it was like the corrupt bargain. There was some backroom dealings that were done. Like, oh yeah, we get it. Ford, you become president. You pardon Nixon. And so the American people never really trusted Gerald Ford, even though really he kind of didn't deserve that, because he really was a very nice guy and well liked. In fact, really, getting ahead of myself there, really, we know Gerald Ford for two things. Okay, one, he's known for pardoning Nixon, which kind of makes him a bit of a pariah himself. And two, he was coming down the steps of Air Force One. And again, I usually show this video clip in class, but he was coming down the steps of Air Force One. It was wet. He was holding an umbrella. He slipped and fell down several steps of Air Force One. The American people kind of saw that, and they're like, "Oh, that's funny." Well, there was a brand new show at the time that was trying to get some ratings because it was coming on late at night. Saturday Night Live had just started with the Not Ready for Primetime Players, and there was one comedian on there in particular by the name of Chevy Chase. And Chevy Chase was a physical comedian. He doesn't do so much physical comedy now because he's older, but back then he used to do a lot of things called pratfalls, and so they would put him in several skits where he was President Ford, and he would fall down the stairs, or he would fall down putting the star on top of the White House Christmas tree, or he would fall down, and the comedians tried to kind of portray him as being something of a bumbling idiot, and he really wasn't. Okay. So one of the things we see happen during this time is the oil embargo. So the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries were controlling all the pricing. Interestingly, we're seeing that right now. We saw a major drop in all of our oil prices, and a lot of people feel like the Saudis right now, who control a lot of that, are doing it to try to destabilize our economy, which really honestly makes a lot of sense. Well, the same thing was going on back in the early 1970s, and about 1/3 of United States energy relied on oil imports. And so what we saw, instead of prices dropping down to almost nothing, we saw prices rise about 400%. In fact, even after their embargo was lifted, the prices remained high, and it had a lot of effects on the American economy, because so much of what we do, transporting goods, everything else, relies on petroleum. And so the United States just experienced a really bad economy. Okay, we had stagnant growth. So the GDP wasn't growing. We had high inflation, so your dollar's not going as far. High interest rates. In fact, economists were trying to figure out a way to sort of characterize it or name it, and they just came up with a new word. They said, well, we don't know. We have stagnation, we have inflation, so they just called it stagflation. We saw unemployment get really high. In fact, we see unemployment hit double digits during that time. It was a bad time. And so it resulted in gasoline shortages. So you see all these people that are lined up here to getting gas, and gas was being rationed at the time, so you can only get so much at a time. And so people started manufacturers started rethinking cars and everything else. And so, 1969, you get right here, the 1969 Mustang Boss 302, or is that, that's the Boss, I can't, is it the Boss 420? No, yeah, it's 302. Boss 302, big engine, lots of power. Okay, awesome, awesome, awesome car. There's the 1974 Mustang. All right, horrible car. Another one of my personal favorites, 1969 Camaro RSSS 396, has the big block in it. I mean, this is one of my ultimate dream cars right here. Okay, sorry, baby, I know, I love you too. 1969 Dodge Charger RT. All right, muscle. I mean, this is the same car that's featured in the Dukes of Hazzard and some of the Fast and Furious movies. Okay, awesome, awesome car. People start buying things like this, the Honda Civic. Okay, small, economical, no power. Definitely not a sexy ride like these things, right? Even Yugoslavia got in on the game. They built a little car called the Yugo, which is ironic because often it did not go. But it did have a rear window defroster, so you keep your hands warm while you're pushing that piece of crap. And so when the election opens up in 1976, Jimmy Carter from Georgia won the election. Again, nice guy. All right. And so really, I think just in the interest of time, I'm going to leave off here. I will come back and talk to you guys about the Carter and Reagan administrations, maybe even get into the administration of George W. Bush. Because if I keep talking, I'm going to go well over an hour here, and you guys don't want that. You don't want to watch a long lecture. So I'm going to go ahead and just stop here, and we'll pick up where this left off when I do the next one. Okay, so guys, thanks for tuning in. Thanks for watching. I hope this helps. Again, I'm doing a lot of overview here, not getting real specific, so my apologies on that one. I really miss you guys. I miss being in class with you all. And this whole situation is just, well, it is what it is, right? So I miss you guys, and I'll see you later.